Your utility bill is going to be one of those pieces of mail you're not going to want to open, but you're going to have to, and those bills are going to be high. So how can you cut back on your energy usage to keep your utility bill down, especially since we seem to be experiencing a hot summer, and as I mentioned, so much of the electricity that we use in the course of a year is eaten up by air conditioning costs. Clair Newbern is an energy broker. He is the co-founder of a company called Live Energy, and he joins me now. Mr. Newbern, thank you for being with us on the program today.
Glad to be here.
On your website, it says the old way of buying and managing energy is dead. I'm curious, what does that mean exactly?
Well, in deregulated markets where we spend a lot of our time, there's options for businesses to lock in electricity prices well into the future and have a lot of control over when they lock in their hedges. And so that's what we're referring to there. Kentucky doesn't have retail choice like we have in markets like Texas or Illinois. So you have less options there, but that's what we mean on that website when we say that.
And do states share energy back and forth if one state has an excess amount of energy stored up? Or is this something that is being discussed to do in the future where states would share energy or more easily share energy back and forth?
Yeah, so they do share energy. There's markets like Texas, which operates like an island, and then you have the Western Interconnect and the Eastern Interconnect. So there is the ability to share power across grid systems, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee is trying to figure out how they can facilitate more sharing, and there's a lot of talk about who needs to pay for the transmission to move power around, who benefits from it, who should be paying the bill. And, all the states have different mandates and different things that are important to them. Like some states have this really aggressive climate-related goals, and then you have markets like Kentucky, which are happy to be on coal generation. And so there's a lot of different competing ideas, and we're having to sort it out right now because the grid is definitely under stress, and we need to build more transmission and more generation. And we're having to figure out what we want the future to look like and how to get there.
There is legislation that's been proposed, right, in the House of Representatives, something called the Reinforcing the Grid Against Extreme Weather Act that would require the commission to establish minimum transfer capability requirements between regions. So, but they're still trying to figure out the process, I guess, in sharing energy.
Yeah, they're trying to figure it out, and that legislation, was put out recently. May not get pushed through, but they're at least talking about it. And then, in states like Texas, there's obviously been we had this big blackout, a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a lot of pressure to figure out how to not let that happen again. And with the war in Ukraine and what's happened to Germany, the biggest thing I think that's happening right now with energy is everyone's rethinking what is important and starting to think more about energy security, because Germany is like in deep trouble right now. If they don't get, natural gas supplied from Russia, and they're finding out how big of a problem it could be if you're reliant on another country, and that country decides that they want to cut you off.
Yeah. Right. Well, what is straining our grid? What are the factors that are straining the electric grid in places like Texas and California, and I guess in other places across the country where you get occasional brownouts?
So it's tricky because in Texas, we've had 25 record-setting days already this year where we use more power than we've ever used before on that particular calendar day. And so the grid has actually handled it, but, we've had to put out a request for conservation. And what a lot of people don't realize is that when you start adding a lot of renewables to the market, you have to balance that. So there are days when we have 20,000 megawatts of wind, and it drops to under 2,000 megawatts. And so the grid operators having to balance. So they're having to ramp up natural gas-fired generation or coal generation to balance, because you've always got to have a nice flat load that where the demand matches the supply. And so when you've got these intermittent resources, the wind stops blowing when it's really hot, then you've got to do a lot more balancing. And so, it's really tricky, and that's the thing that where a lot of people are saying, hey, wait a second, are we getting ahead of ourselves? Do we have too much renewables on the system? Maybe we need more thermal in order to be safe. And so those conversations are happening right now. The reason we're having all these problems is because, it's back to business. We're using a ton of energy. We're also in a La Nina year where the weather patterns are hotter and drier throughout the southern half of the country. And so that's just putting a lot of stress on the grid.
Man, that sounds like a calibration that needs to be done day to day, if not hour to hour. Right? And if if your wind strength is going to drop that rapidly from day to day, I mean, man, that takes constant monitoring, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it takes. They're monitoring it minute to minute. It's funny because people are starting to pay attention to the ERCOT website where it shows the expected demand and how much reserves they have, and it's become something that they put on the news every night. They start to show this this gauge that shows you whether we're going to have blackouts or not. But it's working in Texas. It's one of those things that we definitely have to start planning better and figuring out what makes sense because, as long as we want to keep growing and maintain a standard of living that Americans are used to, we've got to make sure that we have more energy generation. If we're going to electrify vehicles and shift everything to electrified, we definitely have to do some planning and upgrade our grids.
I used to take this stuff for granted. Didn't everybody else? Pretty much. I mean, a brownout could occur. We've had brownouts. We've had blackouts. I mean, that has happened in our history, but not with the frequency that we have now. Isn't this, Mr. Newbern, this is something new. This is something we used to take for granted, didn't we?
Well, if you think about it, historically, all the generation has been thermal, and that's much easier to manage because you turn it on, and you have this nice steady generation profile. But with renewables, that's one of the major new things. So you look at what's different now than 10 years ago. Well, we have a lot more intermittent resources. And when you've got intermittent resources that are coming on and ramping down, the sun is pretty predictable. It's not as predictable. And so the grid has gotten a lot more complex.
Yeah.
I'm all for renewables. I think it's great, but the reality is it's a way more complicated model to operate, and we're just starting to get the amount of renewables in the Texas market where it's becoming a real challenge, and we've got to make some serious decisions about what we want the generation mix to look like to make sure that we can supply everybody without blacking out all the time.
Are we rushing that process, rushing the introduction of renewables into the energy supply at the expense of coal, nuclear, natural gas, and the like?
I don't know that we're rushing. I mean, I think one of the issues is that we simply may not have enough of the thermal generation sticking around, and it may be getting retired too quickly. That's what happened in Germany. They retired these coal plants and they turned off their nuclear plants. In hindsight, they're like, wow, that was a bad move because now they're in trouble and they're having to rely on Russia to supply natural gas. And if they decide not to, then they're in serious trouble.
Is it your profession?
So I think one of the.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
About Germany. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Well, it's just so that's a classic example of learning from their mistake. They turned off their reliable generation too quick. They did not have the renewables to replace it, and so that's something you definitely don't want to do.
Is it your professional opinion? Let's say we were to jump to 25-30% adoption of electric vehicles within the next 12 to 18 months. Is it your professional opinion that the grid can handle it, or no?
No way.
No way. Okay. Because and charging electric vehicles takes the stat I heard today was it takes 4 times the electricity to charge an electric car than it does to air condition your house. Does that sound accurate to you?
Depending on what kind of charger they're using, it could be right. Again, I'm all for okay, let's do EVs. That sounds good.
Yeah.
But if everyone did it tomorrow, no, we'd be in deep trouble. We wouldn't be able to do it. In fact, Tesla's been encouraging Texans to not charge their cars in the afternoon, just because that does put a huge burden on the grid if you've got everyone charging in the afternoon when they get home from work.
Yeah. How does Kentucky's power grid look?
Pretty good. I mean, you guys are mostly coal, and that you got some natural gas too. So coal prices are up, but you guys are somewhat insulated from the type of grid stress that we have in markets like Texas. You guys are in pretty good shape, and your prices have been pretty decent, being that you're mostly coal-fired. everything is up. Coal, natural gas, everything is up significantly, like year over year. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, I was just taking a look before we got on air, and Kentucky's done pretty good compared to the rest of the country where there's, much higher prices.
And so what would you suggest, some quick and dirty tips as to how we can save energy and keep our utility bills down and try to avoid brownouts here or anywhere?
All right, so I'll give you the quick and dirty. Close up cracks on your doors and windows. Yeah. Replace weather stripping so you make sure you keep a good seal, keep the cold in. Close your shades and shutters to keep the heat out during the day. Install a controllable thermostat. Those cost about $100, and they can save you 20 to 30% on your electricity usage. And then the last thing that's easy is to replace incandescent bulbs with LEDs when they go out. If you just start replacing them with LEDs, that'll end up saving you money over the long term.
It's very interesting stuff. I appreciate you sharing that expertise with us today, Mr. Newbern. Thank you very much, and hopefully we can keep the lights on and the power all across the country for the rest of the summer and get these utility costs down. And I'm with you. I think the renewables are the future, but just like with ditching the horse and buggy and adopting petro, it took decades. It took a long time for that transition to happen, and you just can't politically mandate that, I think, in a hurry in order to rush and satisfy some political constituency. But it is the future more than likely.
Yeah, and if you look at every energy transition we've had, like when we discovered oil and then natural gas and nuclear, like the previous generation source, the previous energy source didn't go away. We just added a new one. And so to think that we can just eliminate all these energy sources that we've used over the past 100 years is probably short-sighted. We're going to have to learn to over time, reduce the reliance on other things. But we're going to be using fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. That's the reality.
St. Clair Newbern, co-founder of LiveEnergy.com. He's an energy broker. Mr. Newbern, have a good rest of the week, sir. Thank you for joining us today.
All righty. Thank you.
You bet.